1970 to 1972 was the third most active strike period in the 20th century. 2.4 million workers engaged in large-scale work stoppages in 1970 alone. These strikes puzzled liberals who believed they had solved the problem of class conflict. After all, inequality was at its lowest point in U.S. history. Disposable income had grown 33% in the 1950s and 50% in the 1960s. But this egalitarian society was maintained with hardly any agency from everyday workers. Union lawyers negotiated wages and benefits with corporate lawyers, and non-unionized corporate management set production practices and protocols within a regulatory framework established by government bureaucrats. Yes, wages rose and consumption boomed, but work became more mechanical, more rote, more tedious, and monotonous. When a massive strike broke out in Lordstown, Ohio after General Motors in 1972 introduced new disciplinary measures to increase hourly productivity, the Nixon administration launched a national commission to study the discontent. In Work in America, the commission reported that workers at all occupation levels felt locked in, with no mobility nor opportunity to grow. They felt alienated in a world where they had no say in how they worked. A worker could spend his whole life working in a car factory and know hardly anything about cars. The report's solution was to invest in human relations strategies, which merely empowered management. After decades of triumphalism, the generation of liberals that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s were unlike the New Deal era liberals concerned with the structural inequalities of the capitalist system. New liberals were more concerned with better integrating people into what they believed was a structurally sound economy. In my previous video, I discussed how conservatives started to woo Southern and suburban whites. This video explores how conservatives peeled off another New Deal coalition stalwart, white workers. If you find this video interesting or informative, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Nixon wooed white workers by turning their frustrations against economic programs aimed at alleviating racial inequality. He claimed that these programs were destroying the foundation on which the nation was built by encouraging laziness and expectations of something for nothing. He called this the welfare ethic, which burdened hard-working Americans with onerous taxes.
Senator George McGovern recently submitted a welfare bill to the Congress. According to an analysis by the Senate Finance Committee, the McGovern bill would make 47% of the people in the United States eligible for welfare. 47%. Almost every other person in the country would be on welfare. And who's going to pay for this? Well, if you're not the one out of two people on welfare, you do.
But it wasn't just that the supposed welfare class was leeching off the supposed workfare class. Nixon claimed that government programs victimized the poor as well by making them dependent and helpless, thereby depriving them of pride, dignity, and self-respect. So while appealing to the sense of victimhood of white workers, he could also infuse their opposition to anti-poverty and racial equality programs with a sense of patriotic heroism. At this time, Republicans also began to speak of themselves as the true heirs to the civil rights movement, because they, unlike Democrats, supported colorblind policies. The Civil Rights Act outlaws discrimination in hiring and education on the basis of race, color, religion, and sex. But how do you prove discrimination? Well, intent is very difficult to prove, so instead the Civil Rights Act relies on results. If you hire a disproportionate number of men or white folk, you are probably discriminating. Nixon and later Republicans implied that this is reverse discrimination against white folk. This tactic proved effective. In 1972, Nixon won 54% of the Union vote. But as some of you probably already know, Nixon gets into some trouble over the subsequent 2 years. He resigns in 1974.
Well, I'm not a crook.
And in 1977, Democrats retake the White House. This didn't mean, however, that politics shifted back to New Deal liberalism. A big reason for this was because of stagflation. Stagflation refers to a phenomenon of both high inflation and high unemployment. According to Keynesians of the post-war era, inflation and unemployment are inversely related. Rising employment puts pressure on resources, driving prices up. Falling employment eases pressure on resources, causing prices to fall. This inverse relation is called the Phillips curve. Under this relationship, stagflation should be impossible, yet it happened. How? One of the explanations is energy prices. In 1960, 14 of the major oil-producing countries formed OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC withholds supply to drive up oil prices, and when energy costs rise, so does the cost of everything else, since everything requires energy. What matters for the shifting political winds, however, is how conservatives and liberals explain stagflation. Conservatives like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan argued that government spending would cause social disorder and economic stagnation. Regulations constrained free enterprise and individual creativity, while taxes discourage the hardest working people, and welfare encourages dependency and laziness. Along with stagnation, other issues bothered Americans. Crime rates soared in the 1970s, as did divorce rates. Drug use was high, especially among young folk, and in 1978, the Iranian Revolution replaced the Shah with the anti-American Ayatollah. The 70s is also the decade where the FBI discovered the notion of a serial killer, and stories of gruesome and depraved murders filled the news. Since the 1930s, conservatives had been arguing that the New Deal would disrupt the social order, and now they can say, look what's happening. There's more divorce, because welfare gives women a source of income outside of a husband, and because the Civil Rights Act bars discrimination in hiring based on sex, which allows women to flood the workforce. Later conservatives such as George Gilder argued that by insuring against risk, such as risk of unemployment, old age, poverty, and so on, people stop being responsible, and you end up with a society where anything goes. Capitalists systematically promoted the conservative narrative. Corporate political action committees outnumber labor PACs 3.5 to 1. Wealthy businessmen in 1971 created the Business Roundtable, which funded free market propaganda through the publication of books, radio and television programs, journals and magazines, and in 21 states, curriculums and textbooks that promoted the virtues of free enterprise. In the 1970s, the oil baron billionaire Koch brothers created a libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, and existing economic think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation and the Foundation for Economic Education found themselves flush with cash, enabling them to pump out studies critical of the New Deal and the Great Society, studies that, for instance, showed that unemployment insurance creates more unemployment. But it isn't just economic conservatives who act more in the 1970s. Evangelicism also grew, again largely because of funding from capitalists. After the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, which granted women the right to abortion in their first 2 trimesters, capitalists funded grassroots movements against abortion and the emergence of organizations to oppose abortion and to promote so-called family values, such as focus on the family and the moral majority. Anti-feminist organizations such as Philip Schlafly's Eagle Forum emerged to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have amended the Constitution to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. This amendment fell one state short of passage due to a massive campaign from Schlafly's organization. Schlafly argued that the Equal Rights Amendment would deprive women of privileges, such as the right to be supported by their husbands. With equality, fathers would no longer be compelled to take care of their wives and children, resulting in greater poverty for women and children overall. All these different branches converged on the same idea. The New Deal and the Great Society caused social disorder and stagnation. Now, what caused all this disorder and stagnation? One argument is that the baby boomer numbers simply overwhelmed society. In the 1970s, most boomers were reaching their late teens and 20s, and most violent crime, as well as drug use, is done by people, particularly men, ages 15 to 29. Furthermore, young people tend to be less productive than middle-aged folk because they have less skills. Another explanation is that lead, which was used in gasoline, caused higher crime. There's a strong link between lead and aggression. Scholars have estimated that the banning of lead in gasoline has resulted in 60 million fewer violent crimes since the 1970s. Whatever the causes, the rises in violent crime was global, and declines in the latter part of the 20th century was also global, even in countries that didn't have the conservative counter-revolution. Liberals cared less about ideological good versus evil battles than with the technocratic solutions to managing a modern complex economy. Key to this management was balancing between the interests of capitalists and workers, as represented in the Phillips curve. Labor should get its fair share of the rewards, but capitalists needed their profits in order to operate and to grow the economy. If inflation was too high, it had to mean that labor was too powerful. Not all liberals agreed with this perspective. Some argued that oligopoly, a situation where few firms dominated an economic industry, allowed capitalists to raise prices to make up for lost revenues due to falling demand, which created a vicious cycle where higher prices reduced demand, which in turn led to further price increases. So in 1974, Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey and California Congressman Augustus Hawkins crafted a full employment bill which would have implemented nationally coordinated economic planning to bring about full employment at high wages and a federally mandated right to a job for every American. Notably, the bill combined support from the AFL-CIO and the Congressional Black Caucus, promising the possibility of reuniting white and black labor, which had been divided by Nixon's racist demagoguery. Ultimately, it was not conservatives who defeated the Hubert Humphrey full employment bill, but liberals. Most damning for the bill was the testimony of Lyndon Johnson's budget director, Charles Schulz, who argued that a government jobs guarantee would exacerbate inflation. After his testimony, liberal congressional representatives tabled the full employment bill in 1976. So liberals offered nothing to address inflation and unemployment except austerity. The bill would be revived again under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, who was not a New Deal or Great Society liberal. He was in fact quite conservative. Following Carter's lead, in 1978, Congress replaced concrete plans with long-term targets and neutered the jobs guarantee to an abstract national goal. Instead of nationally coordinated planning, it left the responsibility of full employment to the Federal Reserve. On other issues, Jimmy Carter ended up pretty conservative as well. He signed a cut for the capital gains tax, deregulated the transportation industry, and increased military spending. But while conservatives blamed big government for stagflation and social disorder, Carter fell back on his religious beliefs and spiritual roots.
In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption.
Imagine you are a worker in 1979 and the president tells you that the reason you don't have a job or are struggling to make ends meet is because you're too greedy. Meanwhile, conservatives asserted that the government is the real cause. In this context, Reagan swept to power in 1980. He argued that the government is not the solution to our problems, but is the problem. To show Southerners that he was on their side, he began his general action campaign by giving a speech on states' rights near Philadelphia, Mississippi, a small town famous for one thing, and it isn't their cheesesteaks. It is famous for the murder of 3 civil rights workers. He also openly courted evangelicals by promising to appoint godly judges and godly people in his administration. He boasted that he would aggressively confront the Soviet Union, calling it an evil empire, and he promised to slash taxes and government waste. He doesn't support unions. One of his first acts was putting down the air traffic controller strike, a move that signaled to capitalists that it was open season on organized labor. The percentage of union drives with illegal firings soared during the 1980s as Reagan understaffed the National Labor Relations Board, which meant workers illegally fired for trying to start or join a union could often not get their cases heard for several years. But Reagan would claim that by cutting welfare spending, he was helping workers. Reagan's policies were based on supply-side economics. Keynesian economics was about demand, about increasing consumption and personal income. Supply-side economics says policy should benefit producers rather than consumers. This means tax cuts for the wealthy so they have more income to invest, and less regulations on businesses so they have more freedom to produce. This is supposed to increase productivity, which means more jobs and lower prices. Reagan reduced the top marginal tax rate from 70% to eventually 28%. He cut food stamps for 1 million Americans, as well as aid for housing, and purged the welfare rolls of about 250,000 families. The fortunes of the top 20% of Americans soared, but incomes declined for the bottom 20%, and for the next 40% stayed the same. But it was not all tax cuts. For most working Americans, taxes rose as Reagan raised excise, gasoline, and payroll taxes. Despite slashes to welfare programs, the national debt tripled in the 1980s. That means the wealthy not only got tax breaks, but they effectively got to lend those tax breaks back to the government to fund the deficit. Overall economic growth in the 1980s was unspectacular. What mattered, however, was that Americans felt that the country was headed in the right direction. Inflation eventually fell, as did unemployment. Much of this had little to do with Reagan's policies. Inflation and employment didn't come back to normal levels until about 1986, which also coincided with the breakdown in cooperation within OPEC and the flooding of oil into world markets. But even in 1984, with unemployment still at 8%, Reagan could say that it was morning again in America.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future.
Reagan won the 1984 election in a landslide. In response to Reagan's popularity, a new kind of Democrat emerged, the New Democrats. New Democrats sought to win back the South and the suburbs by pivoting to the right. The first New Democrat president on most measures governed conservatively. He declared that the era of big government was over. He passed a punitive crime bill that funded the hiring of 100,000 more cops and the building of more prisons. It encouraged more punitive sentencing, such as 3 strikes laws, and it made felons ineligible for federal student aid such as Pell Grants. He deregulated Wall Street by repealing Glass-Steagall, the New Deal-era legislation that created a firewall between commercial and investment banks, and he made it so that derivatives, which were a big part of the housing crisis of 2008, could not be regulated through the Commodities Future Modernization Act. He signed into law welfare reform that dramatically slashed welfare spending. Not coincidentally, the number of children living in extreme poverty doubled over the next 15 years. He negotiated over 300 free trade deals and ratified NAFTA, which became not only an ever-present threat to union organization, but also resulted in the displacement of 700,000 small Mexican farmers. He signed the Defense of Marriage Act, which allowed states to refuse to recognize same-sex marriages granted under the laws of other states. The next Democratic president would govern almost equally as conservatively, despite campaigning as a progressive. He refused to prosecute bankers complicit in fraud, ran his mortgage relief program through mortgage companies, who were more interested in foreclosures than in renegotiating. Even after it was discovered that the mortgage companies were using fraudulent documents to foreclose, he declined to leverage that to compel them to renegotiate mortgages. He tried to negotiate a grand bargain on deficit reduction in a period of economic stagnation that called for bigger cuts than even Republicans proposed, and he restored funding to police programs that the Bush administration had been winding down, resulting in an unprecedented militarization of police forces. His administration defended civil asset forfeiture in court, shut down marijuana dispensaries at a similar rate as his Republican predecessor, increased drone strikes tenfold, regime changed the country without congressional approval, and expanded U.S. military operations from 2 to 7 countries. Key parts of the New Deal state, such as Medicare and Social Security, are still intact. With soaring deficits and austerians dominating the power structures of both parties, a continual erosion of the welfare state would not be surprising. Though the United States is by far the most conservative of the global North countries, in the direction of social democratic decline, the U.S. may be a trendsetter. What the history of the New Deal reveals is several lessons about the fragility of social democracy. The New Deal was a response to the seeming collapse of liberal capitalist democracy. With the advent of communism and fascism and increasing unrest in depressed Western countries, the welfare state emerged as a compromise with laissez-faire to preserve capitalism. In preserving capitalism, it preserved capitalists, a class that would never permanently accept restrictions on their own power in pursuit of profits. In Latin America, capitalists have done all they could to prevent even New Deal-style social democracies from taking hold, funding coups and death squads. In the United States, the battle has been more political and ideological, but with enormous wealth derived from a more stable social democratic system, capitalists have more than enough means to wage continuous and pervasive warfare against the welfare state. Capitalism also produces social divisions that capitalists can easily exploit against social democratic programs. In the United States, the New Deal aimed to create a homeowner society and so help the suburbs grow faster than urban and rural areas. And suburbanites formed a social consciousness apart from workers in rural and urban areas and came to view themselves as superior. They considered other groups as threats to their own prosperity and to the nation as a whole. This social hierarchy wasn't just confined to conservative people. The liberals of the 60s and 70s were mostly college-educated professionals who viewed themselves as above the working class. Emblematic of how they viewed the working class was the popular television character Archie Bunker from the sitcom All in the Family. Archie was a one-dimensional, bumbling, bigoted loser, resentful of his college-educated liberal son and of an increasingly diverse society.
Isn't anybody else interested in upholding standards? Our world is coming crumbling down. The coons are coming.
Mainstream feminists, who were mainly middle-class white women, also neglected intersectionality, as powerfully illustrated at the 1975 World Conference on Women. One of the attendees was Domitilla, a labor organizer and wife of a Bolivian miner. Domitilla wanted to bring to international attention the massacres being perpetrated against Bolivian workers by the Bolivian government at the behest of the CIA and of American corporations. For this, she drew the ire of Betty Friedan, the famous author of The Feminine Mystique, a book that showed how nuclear family gender norms were stifling and alienating suburban women. Friedan chided the Bolivian delegation for being manipulated by men and thinking only about politics and completely ignoring women's problems. One woman implored Domitilla to forget the massacres and talk about us, about you and me, well, about women. Imagine telling someone that there are more pressing matters than the ongoing slaughter of their family and friends. Another woman said that men are the enemy, men create wars, men create nuclear weapons, men beat women, and so what's the first battle to be carried out to get equal rights for women? First, you have to declare war against men. If a man has 10 mistresses, well, the women should have 10 lovers also.
Simply incorporating women into positions of power does not guarantee equality or justice in the larger sense. And I think this is a maxim we shouldn't forget. We always seem primed to celebrate individual advancements of black people, people of color, women, without taking into consideration that diversity by itself may simply mean that previously marginalized individuals have been recruited to guarantee a more efficient operation of oppressive systems.
To Domitilla, the real enemy was capitalism and imperialism. However, machismo, or what we in English-speaking countries might call toxic masculinity, served the interests of capitalism by making politics the exclusive domain of men, thereby dividing the working class. Domitilla's conflict with wealthy white folk point to another problem with social democracy, at least as it is practiced in the global north. It is dependent on extracting material wealth from the global south, be it oil, tin, or lithium in the future green economy. Beyond right and wrong, it means that future global supply disruptions and resistance to imperialism can cause economic upheavals such as stagflation. Finally, the New Deal and social democracy more generally failed to address capitalist alienation. Despite Marxism's reputation for crude materialism, the young Karl Marx probably would have agreed with arch-conservative capitalist Barry Goldwater that liberalism neglects man's spiritual and moral self. In his economic and philosophical manuscripts, Karl Marx argued that work makes us human. Of course we work in order to live, but work is also how we express ourselves, commune with nature, and connect with our communities. Think about how, for example, hunting in native cultures was as much a spiritual and cultural experience as it was a means to obtain food. Capitalism, however, turned work into a form of drudgery. It represses and subordinates people in order to maximize productivity. The end result is that most people never feel happier than when they are not working. Modern behavioral economics, by the way, agrees with Marx. Studies on productivity have found that tying performance to monetary incentives leads to worse performance, no matter if the subjects are MIT students or impoverished peasants in rural India. What most people are motivated by, according to these studies, is autonomy, or control of how you do your work, meaningfulness, the belief that your work matters, and mastery, the ability to become more skilled or self-fulfilled through your work. New Deal and Great Society technocratic liberals believed they had found a workable compromise. With the exception of workplace regulations, give capitalists full control over how labor performed its work, in exchange for providing higher wages and benefits for workers. So work for many in the New Deal order was alienating, but at least liberalism delivered material prosperity. With stagflation, however, liberalism stopped delivering the goods. Conservatism didn't deliver the goods either, but it gave life a sense of meaning and purpose. It made people feel like they were essential defenders of what mattered most in life, be it the home, the church, the nation, the community, the family, or even the race. Union leadership, on the other hand, only concerned itself with the technocratic issues of benefits negotiation. Their purpose was maintaining the harmonious functioning of capitalism, which meant rejecting the social justice movements of the era, neglecting to try to expand unionism beyond white workers in the Northeast and Midwest, and even supporting policies such as the Vietnam War. This left the labor movement isolated and vulnerable. Today, millions of people are calling for change. They understandably look to the past for inspiration and answers, but they should remember that the New Deal order declined for a reason. Whatever comes next needs to be more attendant to real democracy. Economic democracy, a democracy where workers broadly defined have more autonomy and purpose in their work and communities.